Welcome back to the program. And now to Afghanistan. James Dobbins is one of America's great diplomatic troubleshooters. He has served numerous presidents in hotspots from Kosovo to Somalia and many places in between. And now he's taking on the mother of all hotspots as U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, overseeing the delicate but critical negotiations that'll determine what's left behind when the U.S. and its Western allies pack up and leave next year. Dobbins was there at the creation. He helped establish the post-Taliban Afghan government, and he saw the flag raised over the reopened U.S. Embassy in Kabul. That was back in December of 2001. Now, 12 years later, the Taliban isn't defeated, and the U.S. and Afghan governments must sit with them at the negotiating table, though the effort almost collapsed before it even began. And in the meantime, the Taliban continues to stage spectacular lethal attacks. So what is the future? Special Envoy James Dobbins, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We've tried this for a long time. It's been American policy for a while to try to get some kind of peace negotiation and resolution at the table with the Taliban. Do you believe that right now you stand a better chance than at any other time?
I think there's some chance. It's a little hard to calculate. The Taliban are certainly ready to talk to the United States, but we're insisting that they also need to talk to the government of Afghanistan. After all, there's most of the issues that divide the Taliban from us, and for that matter from the government of Afghanistan, are internal Afghan issues, and they have to be settled by the Afghans. So we're prepared to foster a negotiation, to participate in a negotiation, to have talks ourselves. The current stumbling block is getting them to also talk to the Afghan government.
Well, you say stumbling block, but of course it is the be-all and end-all. The Afghans say they won't do it. The government won't do it unless there is talking with them as well. But what do you make of, and is this inevitable, that there will be these spectacular lethal attacks at the same time as talks? Or do they have to stop these attacks as a condition for talks?
Well, if they stop fighting, we wouldn't need talks. I mean, I think that, you know, you don't negotiate with your friends and you negotiate with your enemies. Peace talks don't take place after a war. They take place during a war.
All right. Well, in that case, you expect a lot more of these attacks. What about certainly in Afghanistan, there are people who are very divided over the wisdom of this track. They say, particularly the Tajik Northern Alliance, or the women, or the people who've really seen the benefits of these last 12 years, the infant democratic steps, the education, and all of this kind of stuff. They're saying, are you kidding me? The Taliban, these people who were like medieval warriors and kept us in the dark, are they really to be trusted at the bargaining table? Is this really what we're going to be left with?
Well, I think there is a good deal of skepticism, and the skepticism is not unjustified. On the other hand, all the polling data suggests that there is strong popular support for peace, but not just for peace, for a peace based on some degree of mutual accommodation. So it is certainly true that that those who've seen progress over this last 11 years are very loath to give up that progress. And I think at least some elements of the Taliban understand that they can't simply go back to where they were in 2000, that the country has seen too much progress in terms of electricity, roads, telephones, television stations, health clinics, and schools, and they're not going to give that up. So how do you convince the people, the interlocutors, to actually talk to them in good faith? You know, the first, I said that the whole thing nearly collapsed before it began when the Taliban opened their office, you will well remember, and they put up their flag and they acted like they were a legitimate player, a legitimate government, and they called it the Emirate. Well, most people think they want to go back to calling it the Emirate, and that they haven't given up their ideology. And I don't know how you deal with people who have consistently lied to the United States. They lied when the Clinton administration was in office. They lied under the Bush administration about their intentions. How do you hold their feet to the fire and make sure these negotiations happen in the way you want them to? Well, first of all, I'm not absolutely sure that negotiations are going to happen. We're still waiting for a clear response as to whether they're willing to meet with us and meet with the representatives of the government of Afghanistan. I think a lot of the issues you raise are going to have to be worked through in the course of the negotiation, and commitments are going to have to be tested. I don't expect us to negotiate a peace settlement overnight, or indeed probably even over the next year. But we may be able to negotiate some interim steps that reduce the violence and perhaps advance some other causes. And each step will have to be verified and confirmed and executed before you go on to the next step.
Now, I do see you playing down expectations. That's obviously smart. But the fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is that the U.S. is left with no other alternative, right? Because you didn't defeat them on the battlefield. The surge didn't force them to accept the new realities in Afghanistan, the Constitution, or any such thing. And now you kind of have to have some kind of resolution at the bargaining table. So what happens if you don't get one and you're pulling out anyway?
Well, it's an overstatement to say we're pulling out. We're reducing our forces. We're no longer going to be, after the end of next year, in a combat role vis-a-vis the Taliban. But we will have a significant residual American military and civilian presence. We'll have a large assistance program, including a military assistance program. We'll have American soldiers who will be advising and training Afghan units. So there'll be a fairly significant residual American presence and commitment. Furthermore, you know, we have over the last 10 years, and particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, been able to raise a fairly substantial Afghan indigenous set of security forces, police and military. They've now got more than 350,000 troops, and we believe that they will be able to sustain themselves vis-a-vis the Taliban. You're right that the war won't end without some kind of settlement. I think almost all experts agree that the Taliban are not in a position to take over the country, and the Afghans are not in a position to exterminate the Taliban. The question is not whether it ends by some kind of peace settlement. The question is when.
Well, let me say, I'd love to explore what you just talked about. You will have a significant military presence. I know that's your intention. I know everybody wants that. The Afghans who have this, you know, history of feeling abandoned obviously want that, but you still don't have a SOFA agreement. Everybody hoped something would have been resolved by this spring. It hasn't been. And there seems to be deep divisions in Washington about the size of a force in any event. So a group of former U.S. officials have called for America, the administration, to very quickly lay out and clarify what is going to be its presence, just to stop people from hedging their bets and to, you know, have a little bit of confidence on the ground. Do you think that's going to happen? Look, it didn't happen in Iraq. No SOFA. Many people blame the administration for not working at it hard enough. Will it happen in Afghanistan?
You know, I think there's a tendency to overlearn the lessons of Iraq. Afghanistan is rather different from Iraq in several respects. First of all, almost everybody in Iraq wanted us to leave. That's not the case in Afghanistan. Most Afghans want us to stay. Secondly, in Iraq, under George W. Bush, we'd promised to leave. We'd signed an agreement which said we were going to leave on a date certain. So we would have had to reverse that commitment in order to stay. On the contrary, in Afghanistan, we've said we're going to stay. Thirdly, the Iraqis could afford their own defense. They had the money and the human capital to afford their own defense. The Afghans don't. And finally, when we left Iraq, the civil war was over. And it's not over in Afghanistan. So I tend to think that the Iraqi experience is not going to be repeated in Afghanistan.
What is your next step, James Dobbins? What happens tomorrow, next week, in this regard?
Well, I think we have to remind ourselves what's important. I think negotiations with the Taliban are desirable. It would be good if we can get progress, a reduction in violence, and some degree of agreement over the next year, but we shouldn't count on it. The second thing is the military transition, leaving sufficient residual advice and assistance, assets to continue to sustain the Afghan armed forces while they take the lead in the combat. But the most important thing that's going to happen in Afghanistan, more important than either of those two, is the democratic transition. It's the first time in Afghanistan's history that one elected president will give way to another elected president as the result of a free and democratic process. And if that goes smoothly, and if President Karzai is succeeded by a president who's recognized by the population as freely elected and who has substantial political support across the various sectarian divisions in that country, then I think its future is assured.
James Dobbins, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan.